Harriman Institute at Columbia University. We wanted to organize this panel to commemorate the 2 years that have passed since the start of the full-scale invasion, although really it's been 10 years since the annexation of Crimea and almost 10 years of this broader war. The plan for this panel was to showcase the expertise that we have in the Harriman Institute. And I forgot to introduce myself. I am Emma Mateo. I am a postdoc at the Harriman Institute. And I'm standing in for Mark Andryczyk, who organized this panel. Thanks a lot to him. He wasn't able to be here today. So I'm going to try and do my best to replace him. The plan for this panel was to figure out what's been happening in Ukraine recently and how we should think about the third year of the full-scale invasion. We have several faculty members currently at Harriman, including permanent faculty members and visiting scholars and postdoc. Before we get to the presentations, I just wanted to briefly talk about the format. Each of our speakers will talk for about 10 minutes. We have 5 speakers. After that, we'll move on to the Q&A, and we'll try to balance questions from the room and from Zoom. And probably the last thing I want to mention before we jump in is that we've been having a lot of events recently, trying to figure out Russia's involvement in the war, events and developments in Ukraine on the ground. All of these events are on our website. If you go to events, either under Russia Public Policy Series or what we call PER, Program on U.S.-Russia Relations. There are also separate events that are not under these 2 labels. You'll find recordings. So we very much encourage you to look at them. And now I want to go to our first speaker, who is Emma Mateo. Emma is a postdoctoral scholar in Ukrainian studies at the Harriman Institute. Emma works on protests and civil society in Ukraine and Eastern Europe. She has a PhD at the from the University of Oxford, and her work has been focused on protests in Ukraine and Belarus. And today, Emma will talk about the civil society and civilian engagement in the war. Emma?
Thanks very much. I'm going to stand up. So 2 years into full-scale war and 10 years since the onset of war in the Donbass, Ukrainian society is one of ordinary people doing extraordinary things, as Volodymyr Kulyk, the Ukrainian philosopher, said at the Cooper Union in New York earlier this week. And this is what I'm going to be talking about today. I think it's a great place to start our discussion by reviewing the role that ordinary people are part of playing in the war effort. So I'm specifically focusing on civilians and not military actors. So 2 years into the full-scale invasion, Ukrainian civilians are continuing to engage in the war effort in really large numbers. And we know this isn't just anecdotal, although this won't be a surprise if you've been keeping track of what's happening. And my colleagues at the Mobilize project, which is led by Professor Olga Onuk, have been conducting various rounds of surveys. The latest round isn't on here, but we know that around 80% of the population are engaging in the war effort in some way. And this isn't decreasing, according to the most recent round of surveys, which was in September. We have over 60% donating funds, around about 40% engaging in the war effort, and people participating in a variety of other ways. And if, like me, you've been researching Ukrainian protests and civil society for a long time, this won't necessarily be surprising, right? Ukraine is a society which has a very active civil society. Some of my students are in the room. They should know all about this. We have seen Ukrainian society mobilize time and time again in times of crisis, not only in mass protests since 1990, as you can see on the screen, starting with the Revolution on Granite, but of course, most recently, following the Euromaidan or Revolution of Dignity, which took place in 2013 to 14, we saw really widespread societal mobilization and increase in volunteering and organization around supporting the the onset of conflict in the Donbass. So it's really important to understand this broader context, which really underpins the most significant wave of civilian mobilization that we're seeing now. So what I'm going to be talking about is today, I'll do my best to keep to 10 minutes, I can be using the clicker, can't I, rather than the old-fashioned keyboard. It's based on fieldwork and interviews which I conducted in Ukraine last summer. I mostly focused on what was happening in Chernihiv, Dnipro, and Bakhmut as part of a research project I'm working on. But I'm also going to be basing this on survey data collected by my colleagues in which I'm working on analysis. So Ukrainian civilian engagement is taking place across every imaginable sector, and I'll show a little bit more what this looks like at the moment. And really, what we are seeing is people drawing on their existing skills and past experiences in order to contribute to the war effort in the way that is accessible to them, although they often use these skills and expand their experiences into new sectors. Volunteers and civilian actors are engaging with the state in varying ways. So sometimes they are cooperating with the state, sometimes they are filling in the gaps for things that the state isn't able to do at this time, and sometimes they're completely separate. And I'm happy to answer questions on this more because this is quite a complex topic. And this civilian engagement we're really seeing is taking place in every single corner of Ukraine, whether it's things that are happening under occupied territories like the Yellow Ribbon resistance movement, to people all the way back across in Western Ukraine and Lviv, supporting those who are displaced. So we're seeing nationwide engagement, but from place to place, there are also differences in the ways people are responding, in the sense that they're responding to local needs and the local situation. So I'm going to talk a little bit and share some photos from my field work, so we have a little bit of a better idea of the ways that people are engaging. So military support is a massive element of the way civilians are engaging in the war. This shouldn't be much of a surprise to anyone. Different types of actors, from independent volunteers to groups of friends to more established NGOs, have been working to provide the military with non-lethal items such as medicine, clothing, and equipment since the very early days of the war. Over time, this has shifted a little bit. Initially, the military really needed very basic items such as clothing. But now the state is better able to provide for this. So what we're seeing is volunteers and civil society becoming key in the provision of certain specialist items, right? So civilian actors are crucial in the provision of drones, which, there's a bit of legal haziness around whether or not you're actually allowed to bring these into Ukraine, and also are playing a very crucial role in other things such as providing 4x4 vehicles for military units in the country. So these photos are all from various warehouses and initiatives in Dnipro. And these are basically groups of ordinary Ukrainians who have got together to fundraise and provide things such as these are boxes that's full of tourniquets and chest seals, military equipment. Here we've got trench candles, which are handmade. And then in this corner, we've got folks who are getting together to weave military camouflage nets, which is also a really common activity taking place all the way across Ukraine. But civilians are also supporting the military in more creative ways. We're seeing a really interesting area develop where civilian actors are providing specialist items for injured service personnel. And Superhumans is a very kind of well-known example of this, but this also goes down to much more grassroots efforts. This is unfortunately slightly obscured by the bar, but this is a project that was started in Dnipro. Oh, thank you so much. Where women are sewing adapted clothing for injured service personnel so that when they're recovering and they have frames on their body, they're able to be dignified and have clothing. We also have other initiatives, such as particularly in cities that are closer to the front lines, folks getting together to provide home-cooked food and treats. So this amazing lady was making biscuits for troops on the front line in 36-degree heat, that's Celsius, which is hot for the and then, of course, there's very many fundraising efforts taking place both online and in person. So in the bottom left, this gentleman has a little cafe in Dnipro, which sells French patisserie, but also is fundraising by auctioning off painted used military hardware. But of course, support for civilians is also a really important area of civilian engagement. So civilians supporting other civilians. Of course, this often has taken the form in the provision of goods and housing and psychological and emotional support for displaced people from other parts of Ukraine. whilst the government is starting to work on the reconstruction of damaged housing, we're also seeing civilian actors playing a really important role in this, particularly in regions such as Chernihiv, where the Russians have now withdrawn, but there is a massive need for reconstruction. They're rescuing and rehabilitating animals, folks are donating blood when there have been local strikes. We know that civilians have been playing a really important role in evacuating people from occupied and frontline territories when, larger organized humanitarian organizations are not present, and have also been providing support for other civilians under blockade. So I interviewed a lot of people in Chernihiv, and it really became clear that when the city was almost completely surrounded by Russians for 38 days and cut off, actually it was volunteers working with the local city authorities, which was really helping ensure that people had food and medicine and were able to survive as far as possible under occupation. But we're also seeing interesting trends in civilian cultural resistance, right? So we know that Russia is trying to destroy Ukraine's identity, is trying to deny the fact that Ukraine exists as an independent nation. So we're seeing a lot of interesting initiatives where people are promoting or preserving traditional Ukrainian heritage and handicrafts. So these two photos are from an exhibition organized by a group of artisans from Bakhmut who managed to evacuate a collection of historic textiles from the city under bombardment. And now when I was in Kyiv, they put on this exhibit at the Folk Museum. We're also seeing the protection and restoration of historic buildings. I don't have any photos of this, but particularly in historic cities such as Chernihiv that were heavily bombarded, we're seeing civil society engage in this. And we're also seeing forms of cultural resistance intersect with other forms of engagement in the war effort. So people using traditional crafts and practices for therapeutic use. So in the bottom, this was a workshop conducted in Dnipro, where folks who had been displaced from other parts of Ukraine were taught how to make traditional motanki, which are cloth dolls, as like a therapeutic exercise. And then the same craftswoman who was running this workshop also makes and sells these cloth dolls to raise money for an NGO. Just a shout out, you can buy these in the Ukrainian museums. I didn't intend to do that for a second. We managed to. So let me briefly sum up by talking about some of the motivations for engaging in the war effort in this way, and then what this means for the future. And I hope Anton will start to wave if I won't that. So both survey data from the Mobilise project and my conversations and interviews with people show that a really strong sense of duty appears to be coming through and motivating the way the civilians to engage in the war effort. So several different people told me a variation of like, if not me, then who, right? So if I don't do this, who else is going to do this? This idea that as Ukrainians, we need to participate in the war effort. And when we conduct statistical analysis and look at who's engaging in the war effort, it seems to be that it's also people who have a strong sense of civic duty. They're people who also believe it's important to vote, it's important to engage in civil society, people who are ready to protest if the issue arrives. This survey data and statistical analysis also shows us that people who are engaging in the war effort appear to be folks who have a strong commitment to democracy, people who believe that democracy is the best system. So there's perhaps the idea that this engagement in the war effort is driven by an idea to safeguard Ukrainian democracy. What we also see coming through is a very strong desire to contribute. So this duty being manifested through the usage of existing skills and knowledge. So the folks who can bake are baking, the folks who can sew are sewing, the folks who can drive and have a car, they're helping to evacuate people or transport goods where they're needed. Right. And what's also particularly interesting for me as somebody who researches protest and is interested in what motivates people to actually engage, is that a lot of this mobilization appears to be facilitated by pre-existing network ties, right? So those who are engaged in different kinds of organizations or embedded in, friendship networks, workplace networks, they're often mobilizing alongside their colleagues or their fellow activists, or people who weren't necessarily engaged before. When I asked them, how did you get involved in this? What made you start to do this? They would say, well, I saw on Facebook that my friend was doing this, so I reached out to her and then I started to join in. So the connections between people are incredibly important in helping people engage in work. And whilst it's really difficult for us to quantify, although I know some colleagues who are trying to work on this, to what extent this widespread civilian engagement has been facilitating Ukraine's continued resistance, it is undoubtedly playing some kind of a role, right, in the big picture. But I think what's also really important to acknowledge, and it came through to me in my interviews and fieldwork, is that at the individual picture, this civilian engagement is very important. It seems to be helping people cope. It seems to be a way of people expressing their agency and being able to contribute in some small way when everything feels out of control and hopeless. Some really interesting conversations were had with people who experienced things like the blockade of Chernihiv and would say, this was the worst time and the best time of my life because it was horrific, but I really saw how people can work together to support one another. So this is something that I'm looking at more in my research, the way in which engaging in the war effort and finding a way to contribute helps people survive very difficult circumstances. So the relevance of this engagement as we move into the third year of an ongoing war is something that's really important to think about, right? So with Ukrainian civilians so engaged and so invested in the war effort, it's crucial that we ensure discussions about reconstruction or discussions about paths to peace are including Ukrainian civil society and are taking account of the attitudes that these folks are holding, right? Within all of these different groups and organizations of varying types, there's an awful lot of knowledge and experience and skills which can contribute to the war effort and discussions about a path to peace, and they shouldn't be sidelined for the sake of, high-level political actors. And whilst it's a fantastic story and in a lot of ways is very inspiring that Ukrainian society is doing a lot and continues to do a lot 2 years into full-scale war, we really need to not view this as, okay, Ukrainians are doing great, they've got this, right? Ukraine's sustaining military support is crucial so that the war can come to a victorious and peaceful conclusion as soon as possible and people can start rebuilding their lives, and undoubtedly civilians will continue to play a big role in this. So thank you very much, and I'm looking forward to the rest of the discussion and what my colleagues have to say.
Thanks very much, Emma. All right, our next speaker is Volodymyr Kulyk, who is a head research fellow at the Institute of Political and Ethnic Studies at the National Academy of Sciences of Ukraine, and currently a visiting professor at the Department of Political Science here at Columbia. He taught at Yale, Stanford, and other distinguished places. And his work is on the politics of language, memory, and identity. And today he will talk about the challenges of mobilization and related.
Yeah, thank you. It's great to be here. It's great to see some of my students here, even though I forgot to mention about this event in my class. So they know better than listen to me. I think I will not talk about the areas of my expertise, namely language and identity. My data, which are partly published and partly will be published soon, are a bit older. So if we are to talk about Ukraine after 2 years of the war, at the beginning of the third year of the war, you need to talk about something more dynamic and more recent. So I venture to kind of to come beyond the topics I study narrowly as a scholar of language and identity. I will wear a hat of a Ukraine analyst more generally. I hope I will supplement what Emma told us by talking about kind of less extraordinary deeds, about more understandable, more kind of normal feelings. This is primarily the feeling of fatigue. So if we are talking a lot about Western fatigue, of Western Ukraine fatigue, we should also talk about Ukrainians' war fatigue, which is completely understandable, which is extraordinary in itself that Ukrainians are not too tired of war, but they are. And we should take that into account when we look at these extraordinary things. These extraordinary things are remarkably widespread, maybe extraordinarily widespread, but I would argue that they are still an extraordinary accomplishment of an engaged minority. And there is a majority whose main preoccupation is to survive, is to endure and to survive. and so we should talk about them. Of course, we need to study them, and I don't study them. I spent a year among them, being one of them in Kiev in the first year of the war. But the next year, I was in the US and I was looking at that from abroad. So I will first start from public opinion, from some pieces of public opinion, and then come to my observation of media discourse and social media discourse. So we are witnessing, observing a slow change in public support for the state in waging the war, and lower confidence in Ukraine's victory. The percentage of those who say that Ukraine will certainly win is now at 60%, while it was at 80% just half a year ago. When asked about how the war will end, the percentage of those who believe that the war will end with the restoration of territorial integrity of Ukraine with the 1991 borders is now at 52%, while it used to be at 61%. I mean, not extraordinarily, but markedly. When asked about whether Ukraine should only rely on military force to win the war, or also engage diplomatic efforts, an increasing part of the population said diplomacy is also needed. It used to be 59%, and now it's 72%. So a minority only believes that the military effort is the only way forward. At the same time, there is an even greater increase in percentage of those who believe that the West is getting tired of Ukraine and support of the West is weakening, which is true. But what matters here is how Ukrainians perceive it. So while in 22 it was 15%, and now it's 44%. So almost a half of Ukrainians believe that the West is getting tired. At the same time, Ukrainians still demonstrate remarkable willingness to endure. So when asked, how long are you ready to endure the war? And of course, we understand that this question is something where social disability bias is maybe at strongest. Yeah, so we should keep that in mind. But even so, the percentage of those who say as long as it takes, it's the same as 2 years ago and a year ago, currently at 73%. And even in the East and South, those regions we are most ravaged by the war, it is still at 70%. So which is completely remarkable. And at the same time, just below the quarter, at 24% currently, those who say that they are willing to endure a few months to a year. So which is a minority, a sizable minority, but 3 times lower than those who say as long as it takes. Having said that, there is a growing perception in Ukraine that the situation is worsening. There is a standard question whether things are going in the right direction, the wrong direction. And in May 22, it was 68% saying the right direction and 16% in the wrong direction. Now it's pretty much equal, 44 to 46. Especially in the West, there is a growing perception that things are going in the wrong direction. Again, they are not suffering as much as those in the East, but they're looking forward to kind of normal life and normal disappointment with the government. That's what Ukrainians excel at. Yeah. Similar to that, there is a decrease in trust in the land. Compared to 90% in the first months of war, which is of course was truly extraordinary, and no leader can boast that. But there is a very pronounced decrease. And Kiev International Institute of Sociology conducting a survey conducted an experiment inadvertently, because in the middle of their survey, Zaluzhny was ousted, and so they managed to prove that just by the 2 parts of the sample, before the ousting of Zaluzhny and after ousting Zaluzhny, differed markedly. By 5%, the trust in Zelensky dropped just because of this one unfortunate move. At the same time, the trust in Zaluzhny is at 94%. So Zelensky obviously made a mistake. Miscalculated in terms of public opinion. Of course, maybe for his other goals, he did it right. So I argue that part of the reason of this change in public opinion is expected change in the mobilization regime and the mobilization strategy. So there is an obvious need for changing that. So the Ukrainian army, the Ukrainian armed forces is in need, in desperate need of people. Yeah. So those who were drafted or who volunteered in 22 expire. Not only they are extremely tired and they need rotation, but most of them are dead or wounded. And so at the same time, the realization that this is needed doesn't translate so easily into the willingness to contribute on the part of this silent majority whose main preoccupation is to survive. And so we've seen something unheard of during the early months of the war, this activization of draft dodgers. So they're not so invisible now. We all knew that they were there, but now they become visible and audible. They are visible on the social media. They organize closed groups discussing the problems and how to resolve them, how to ensure that they are not drafted, how they can flee Ukraine, or how they can avoid these drafters. These people from draft stations, the officers, are received in a very hostile manner in many places. And we saw something very extraordinary, a road blockade in one from Kyiv Oblast, when there was a rumor that these people will be coming, angry women, hit their man and block the road to started checking all the cars. Of course, it was a kind of hysterical reaction to a rumor. So it might have been provoked or might be incidental, but that's an indication that the situation in society is not very favorable to meet this challenge. So the authorities are unfortunately not willing to take the political responsibility for this, because they know that this is an extremely unpopular move, and they do not want to be those who are associated with this move. They would like to shift this burden to the army, but Zaluzhny, who won, made it clear that it's not his job. When he was a chief of commander-in-chief, he said, "No, I have to wage the war, but I need people who are to be delivered by the government," and which is true. But the government doesn't want to do that. The government presents the need as originated not in the war itself, but in the army. So the army leadership needs people. So we have to do that. And so we see the strategy of avoiding responsibility in the treatment of a new law. It became obvious that a new law is needed to change the situation with mobilization. But the law was first submitted in late December, then heavily critiqued, then revoked, recalled, then revised, then resubmitted, but not voted yet. So, and it's already been 2 months since the first submission. So definitely they in no hurry. Avdiivka or no Avdiivka, they are being very cautious. They understand that that very unpopular law will be their loss politically. So unfortunately, alternative strategies of kind of recruitment via recruiting centers are not effective. So we obviously need good old mobilization, and it's extremely unpopular among society, partly because there is no trust in fairness of this mobilization. There is still belief that it might be in the favor of the poorest and less protected, having less access to blood, yeah. So or to money to pay out. Zelensky is facing this challenge of disappointment in his core constituency. He was able to enjoy this safe and popular existence for 2 years, partly because those who did not vote for him actually were on the front line, and both fighting and doing these extraordinary things that Emma told us about. Most of those people are this engaged, active part of the Ukrainian population who did not vote for Zelensky. So those who did vote relied on, wanted him to keep his promise of demobilization. That was he promised him when he got elected in 2019. Now he need to engage them. And that's extremely unpopular, and he obviously is not happy about having to do that. So I'm not very optimistic about Zelensky's willingness to make this challenge, which I believe is no less serious than the diminished Western military and financial aid. What we need is more public discussion. It's changing the media discourse. The end of this telemarathon, which provides a good, sweet picture about Ukraine's victory soon and Western aid and everything. We need ideally a coalition government as a manifestation of national unity. But I believe Zelensky is not ready to that, because unfortunately he's no Churchill, who was determined to win the war even at the price of losing the power at the peace. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Our next speaker is Elise Giuliano, who's a senior lecturer in political science department and the director of the ME program at the Harriman Institute, and also director of the program on U.S.-Russia relations. Elise has been studying public opinion and identity in Ukraine since 2014, and she will continue Volodymyr's discussion of public opinion, how we should think about studying public opinion in Ukraine.
Thank you, Anton, and thanks to everyone who participated in this today. Before I start, I just want to mention, inappropriate or not, that this may be a good week to call your representatives in Congress and ask them to bring the bill to the floor so that Ukraine's army can get funded. Okay, now back to my other role here, my main role. So I'm going to talk about public opinion in a little bit of a zoomed out way. I want to make a case that it's important to understand or to think about, to understand public opinion in Ukraine, it's really necessary to be aware of narratives that exist in society, especially narratives that are binary or sort of lend the idea that public opinion in Ukraine is polarized. These kinds of narratives have persisted for years, both within academia and outside academia. For example, I'm sure you're all familiar with the idea of two Ukraines, the putative pro-Russian East and the pro-Russian West. Another narrative that developed after 2014, which echoes the idea of two Ukraines, is that Ukrainians who didn't support the Maidan revolution were victims of Russian propaganda. Again, this is not so much a narrative as sometimes maybe even an assumption. But again, it kind of lends itself to a dichotomous understanding. People are either pro-Maidan and pro-Europe, or they're pro-Russian because they're victims of Russian propaganda. Now, since the war, in order to understand public opinion, it's really necessary to be aware of the public discourse and influential narratives that tend to simplify, flatten, or even misrepresent opinions among Ukrainians. And it's important to keep these narratives in mind when examining polling data on public opinion. So some narratives seem to hold Ukrainians up to an impossible standard, both as individuals and as a nation. For example, many Ukrainians have shown themselves to be resilient and tenacious in the face of the horror of war. This is a fact that should be recognized and lauded, and something that I'm sure you've all heard. But one strand of a narrative that has developed around the idea of Ukrainian resilience is the idea that Ukrainians will never stop fighting and will continue a war of guerrilla resistance against Russia if need be. Well, who knows? Some would, some wouldn't. But I want to just make the argument that we should be aware that this narrative of heroism and resistance may inform the way pollsters write questions or frame survey questions, as well as the way people answer them. So survey respondents may want to provide answers consistent with certain narratives, rather than with ideas that may seem on the face of it less heroic or less patriotic. In other words, there's a social desirability bias in the way people answer polls. So Ukraine has excellent polling and sociological firms and polling agencies, and we're lucky that they do. We rely on them. Scholars rely on them, journalists rely on them, the US government relies on them. But my big concern tonight is just to raise the idea about how we should interpret public opinion data during war and amidst the presence of various narratives. And I want to suggest that analysts should be circumspect about what we can learn from polls in Ukraine, especially now during wartime. The research I conducted prior to Ukraine's invasion in 2022 indicates, for example, that many different polling agencies offered respondents a binary alternative with regard to the important issue of Ukraine's geopolitical orientation, i.e., do you support integration with Europe or do you support Russia's customs union, EU versus Russia's economic union? That was a question that was posed for many, many years, even prior to 2014, and it continued to be framed this way by most polling agencies after 2014. And after 2014, we saw that there was a shift in the answers and a large increase in orientation toward Europe. Growing support for the EU especially, a little bit lower, but also increased support for NATO. And a corresponding decrease in support for Russia's customs union. So while that trend is accurate, I want to mention that I did focus groups in Kharkiv, and I heard people articulate other alternatives. For example, one alternative, this is just summarizing them, that Ukraine should remain independent of both poles, of both the EU and of Russia, and should independently engage with multiple countries. So sometimes this was accompanied by kind of resentment of the great powers, sometimes just a kind of practical, pragmatic kind of, Ukraine shouldn't be obsessed with the great powers. It should just do its own thing and make its own arrangements. Another alternative we heard was that Ukraine should engage with both Russia and Europe. But by not picking up on these alternatives, the polls produced a picture of Ukraine that was more polarized than it actually was, especially along the East-West dimension. And that reinforced the narrative of an East-West divide. Okay, so that's just an example of kind of, how I think we should be a little bit circumspect in the way we think about polls. Okay, now some data. I'm just going to focus on two questions that are current: willingness to negotiate and willingness to make territorial concessions. Okay, so as Volodymyr's excellent presentation suggested, there's a growing willingness to negotiate. This is in flux, so we can't, say that this data is like that this is fixed. But one poll from the fall showed that 42% of Ukrainians think Ukraine should engage in negotiations with Russia to try to achieve peace. So it's a minority opinion because the majority still is not willing to negotiate. But it still seems a little bit like a trend because, it was just 29% last year who were willing to negotiate. Now 42% again. So it's not a majority, but it's growing. We don't know why, we don't know much about it. And this is just one of the questions that was asked in a key survey. And it's really interesting to analyze why. I'll discuss that more in a minute. But what about the willingness to make territorial concessions? Here's a different story. Polls here quite clear, at least recent ones, that a small minority of Ukrainians support territorial concessions. Again, from Keys, in December 2023, only 14% of respondents reported supporting concessions. And there's still a little bit of a trend or an uptick towards supporting concessions, territorial concessions, but it's very small. It was in 2022, only 9% of respondents did, and now 14%, as I just said, as of December. In the South and East, it's a little bit higher of an uptick, according to this data. Last May, before the counteroffensive, 8%, now 21% in the East and 22% in the South. So, that's a slight uptick in the East and South, the regions that are really bearing the brunt of the invasion. But keep in mind that still 67% of people who are in the East and South, closest to the war, oppose territorial concessions. And those figures are not too different than Ukraine's other macro regions. Okay, so in January, my research assistant, Dan Thomas, who's sitting right here in the audience, and I did a quick virtual survey using snowball sampling of 35 people. All the interviewees were educated, highly educated, or middle class. So they are not representative. And basically they all live in Kyiv, except for I think one person. We asked them if they thought that, quote, Ukrainians were ready to fight against Russia indefinitely or willing to make some concessions to Russia, even if the concessions are unfair, end quote. We also asked them what kind of concessions they'd be willing to make. So just really quickly, almost everyone stated strongly that they were not willing to make any concessions to Russia to end the war. And the main reasons they gave were first, because if the war ends, it will be temporary. Russia will simply invade again and seize more territory and destroy Ukraine as it has in the past or through history. Or second, because Russia's goal is the destruction of Ukraine and Ukrainians, so it cannot be trusted to keep its word, For example, quote, somebody said concessions would not end the war, they would freeze it and transfer it to the next generation. Several mentioned that concessions would mean that the death of previous generations would be in vain. So reading these was actually pretty inspiring. And as educated Kievans, keep in mind that these are the arguments and the voices that we are most likely to hear in the West. Only 3 people stated that they were willing to make concessions. And I would like to quote from one, again, not representative, but it goes back to my theme of suggesting maybe the limits of polling. And this person who lived in Europe said, my general impression is that Ukrainians currently staying abroad speak against concessions, and so do politically active citizens staying in Ukraine, mostly those who volunteer and donate and post about it. Or at least that's a picture I'm getting from social media. But my parents who are in Kiev now see something different. They're not active on social media. They maintain face-to-face contact with friends and neighbors, and they note overall fatigue, disappointment, and fear among friends and neighbors. Common people are sick of war and uncertainty and may even welcome negotiations with Russia. Anything might be tolerated at this stage as long as fighting ceases. She went on to say that she was not interested in the concession of not joining NATO, but be that as it may, it just gives a different picture. So it just kind of returns to my point that, and I'm going to finish up here, that polls may be framing questions in ways that are patriotic, or given the exigencies of war and given the narratives that exist, they may be framing questions in ways that are patriotic and socially acceptable for leaders and elites. And respondents to these polls may be giving answers that are socially acceptable, especially over the phone. So again, social desirability bias. So a few quick methodological points about the phone surveys, because Keys, which I think is the best polling agency, is using phone surveys instead of their normal face-to-face surveys because of the war. So the telephone means that we could question whether the polls are fully representative in the East and the South, especially near the front line, not just because it may overlook the elderly who don't have phones, but also because it may they may fail to find the less educated or the less westernized parts of the population who are less likely to trust an anonymous voice over the phone, as opposed to whether if somebody walked up to them face to face and they were able to be convinced by that person or have that kind of interpersonal trust. And so without face to face, I would suggest they may not be convinced by a pollster to participate in polls. And that human element may kind of reinforce this sort of mistrust, or they don't have the bandwidth or the energy or the time because they're so busy, working in hospitals or trying to find food, or especially the people the closest to the front line. And so this may correlate to mistrust of all authorities, or even ambivalence about the war, or even something that I picked up on focus groups, which is kind of like blaming all authorities for the war. I'm talking about war in Donbass and before 2022, which was something that wasn't so common, but we heard it. Like Ukraine, it's who knows why these elites are doing this to us, but we're for people who are suffering. And that's an answer that diverges, as I said, from mainstream views, but it's typical and understandable for people who experience violence, dislocation in Ukraine's war and in other wars. So again, to kind of reiterate some of the points that Volodymyr made, there's fear, there's fatigue, people want peace, they may want to keep their family members alive. This is not something that polls are really picking up on or kind of giving them the space to articulate. And it's a normal human response, and it's not unique to Ukraine. So Chechens also during their war were so tired, wanted to end the war so badly after the second war, that many of them, even though they opposed Putin and Kadyrov, preferred peace and Putin's Russia to war. So that's just to say that this is not, that we could look at other cases of war fatigue and sort of think about how that might inform the ways that people think about their answers to pollsters. And something to keep in mind. And I really like that point about the majority of the people, just trying to survive, the point that Volodymyr made. Okay, thank you.
Our next speaker is Timothy Frye, who is a Marshall Schulman Professor of Soviet Foreign Policy here at Columbia. Also a former director of the Harriman Institute. Tim is a distinguished scholar of political institutions and public opinion in the post-Soviet space. And he will talk today about aid for Ukraine and support for aid for Ukraine.
Thanks a lot. Those were three really terrific presentations, and I'm going to shift direction quite a bit here by talking about some research I've done on support for aid to Ukraine in the United States. And I should say that this was funded by the Harriman Institute. That was the largest supporter. So I'm sure all of you are wondering, and I'm wondering too, will Congress pass aid to Ukraine? When will they pass it? What will it look like? And I don't have a good answer for that for several reasons I'll talk about. But I want to make just a couple of main points. One is that we all talk about war fatigue. And we need to recognize what's the proper benchmark against which we measure fatigue. In March 2022, 77% of Democrats, 74% of Republicans were in support of U.S. aid to Ukraine. I'll show you lower figures today, but let's remember that those numbers are falling from a tremendous height, right? So, and how much of this is to be expected after 2 years of war? How much of it is just a normal kind of regression to the mean, and how much is it, oh my God, things are really bad and I really want to change? It's very difficult to tease out. So I want to make one of the main points I'll make is that it's really hard to move public opinion on support for aid to Ukraine. And I'll talk about how I came to this conclusion. There are a couple of things that work, but for the most part, people are pretty dug in on this issue. Now, I won't talk a lot about the importance of aid, U.S. aid for Ukraine. I'm not a military expert, but all the military experts I know say this is just critical, just really critical. And we see the effect of it already with Avdiivka, and the longer the absence of U.S. aid to Ukraine continues, I think the worse it will be. Just a little bit on the size of the aid. I'll show some numbers. And we want to remember that most of it stays in the U.S. and it's really a fraction of the military budget, 5.6% at this point. So it's really not a lot of money. If we look at why U.S. aid is important, well, EU institutions altogether are contributing more aid to the U.S., but it's overwhelmingly financial aid, whereas the U.S. is really critical in providing military aid. So that's why the U.S. role is really important here. And it's very difficult for Europe to play the same role that the U.S. does. However, if we look in terms of share of GDP, you'll see that most other countries are carrying a much larger load as a share of GDP. The U.S. isn't even on here. It's only at 0.3% of the size of the economy, right? So, and to give you some sense of how big U.S. aid is relative to other things that we spend money on, state of Virginia budget is about $81 billion, which is about the same as aid to Ukraine in 2022. The NASA budget was about a third of it. But on other things we spend far greater amounts of money. So it's important when we talk about aid to Ukraine to kind of keep it in perspective. Okay, what's the current state of play? Just before I came here, I saw Speaker Johnson give a 2-minute statement where he did not mention the word Ukraine. He did mention the special supplementary bill that includes aid for Ukraine, but it was in passing, and it was, as he often does, only as a secondary thought to the first issue of taking care of the border, and then we'll deal with everything else. So One thing I will say is that there's been much backtracking on the Republican side, and it's largely due to President Trump. I spent last spring from January through June at the Library of Congress, and we regularly held events with members of Congress, and two of them were on Ukraine. And many of the moderate Republicans took me aside to reassure me and say, "Don't worry, we got this. We recognize that there is a small anti-Ukraine caucus, but don't worry, we got this." However, since President Trump has really weighed in heavily, many Republicans, Lindsey Graham in particular, is the kind of clearest example, have really caved and really changed their position. However, I do think that if there was a vote on aid to Ukraine, it would pass with a majority in the House. Okay, so let me talk about public support for aid to Ukraine. I want to say that it's still strong. And what we've seen is Democratic support has remained remarkably high. And this has not gotten nearly as much attention as it should. We've seen independent support for Ukraine still be quite high. And it's really Republican support that's declining. But we need to keep in mind that registered Republicans are less than a third of all Americans. Right? So when we add these numbers together, there's a considerable support for aid to Ukraine. Now, it depends on wording. Of course, if you ask the too much or too little question, you get lower numbers, but you still get on the order of 40% of Americans saying that the US is spending too little or is the right amount, and less than 40% saying the US is spending too much for the most part. And again, it's mostly Republicans, right? So if you ask about continuing support to send aid, a majority still support it. And this is remarkable for several reasons. One is, if you ask Americans about whether they like foreign aid in the abstract, they hate it. 50 to 60% of Americans are not in favor of foreign aid. They think it's 25% of the budget, when it's really 1%, and they hate it. So the fact that a majority of Americans still say they want to send aid to Ukraine is really important to keep that in context. Moreover, it's much more bipartisan in support on other issues. If you look at immigration, for example, only immigration and healthcare, for example, roughly 18% of Republicans think that the U.S. government should provide healthcare. And only about 12% of Democrats think that immigration should be decreased, right? So what I'm saying is that the floor here is much higher on this issue than it is on lots of other issues that really have huge partisan gaps, right? Okay. So I'll talk about a survey I did in early September. So this was a time when support was more robust than it became in December. And I asked about support for military aid, economic aid, and for providing aid until the end of fighting. So what we see is that overall, 67% favored military aid, 65%, and 56% favored providing aid until the fighting ends. We see a 33-point gap between Democrats and Republicans, which is normal in American politics. And we see, this was surprising to me, that support for fighting till the war ends was as high as it was. Okay, so even even here with more than a third of Republicans saying that you should supply aid until fighting ends, suggests that there is a lot of support for this policy in society. Okay, so I was interested in what moves public support for aid to Ukraine. So I did this experiment where we had 8 different prompts that we gave to people, right? 1/8 of the sample just got no information. It's just a question that said the U.S. has supplied a variety of economic and military aid to Ukraine. Do you support military aid to Ukraine, economic aid, or fighting till the war ends? Another 8, randomly chosen, was reminded that Ukraine is a young democracy who was attacked unjustly and is experiencing war crimes. We also had another 8 that we said we gave additional information that aid is costly, and those funds should be better used to provide economic development at home on defense and on healthcare. We also had a prompt in there about escalation fear, that some people are worried that giving aid to Ukraine raises the risk of escalation. We also had a prompt in there about deterrence, where we said that giving aid is important to deter Russia and China from undermining global security. And then we also gave 3 appeals where we added former President Trump and the economic appeal, President Biden and the deterrence appeal, and then a bipartisan appeal of McConnell and Biden, each together saying that it's really important to provide aid to Ukraine to ensure deterrence. Okay, so what we want to do is compare whether giving people these arguments for and against aid for Ukraine, does it change the views from the control group? Right. And one important thing to bear in mind is, 40% of respondents said that they were following the issue closely, and 60% said they were not following the issue closely. Now, for people who are following the issue closely, these prompts are probably not going to have much effect because they've already thought this all through. This is not new information for them. But for the 60% that we're not following, sorry, there should be a not there, we might expect there to be some more movements here. Okay, so what do you think we found? I already gave away the punchline.
Not much movement.
I know, that's what I'm gonna get at. I gave away the punchline already. So how do we know that there's not much movement? Well, see these dots? This is the green dots are for Republicans, the red ones are for independents, and the blue are for Democrats. And they're mostly around the 0 line, which means that they don't move it much in either direction. Moreover, these long lines, these are just confidence intervals. And when they cross 0, it tells you that they're not statistically significantly different from the control group. So we did all of this work, spent all of this money, did all of this time, and we find that public opinion towards Ukraine is really pretty stable for people who are following the issue. For people who are not following the issue, and again, this is 60% of the populace, we're weird, right? Because we're following this issue very closely. We're abnormal. We see that Democrats are moved by this normative appeal. And this is impressive because if you remember, 85% of Democrats are already in support of this. So there are real ceiling effects. It's hard to raise that number even higher, but we see that giving respondents information about this normative appeals, it does move opinion for Democrats. This bipartisan appeal also, this appeal saying that Joe Biden and Mitch McConnell both support aid, it does have some effect for Democrats. The Biden appeal, it comes close to being significant, but again, these are really, Democrat support is already really high, so it's hard to move it higher. On the Republican side, this is the big one, right? Telling people that Trump opposes aid to Ukraine really moves Republicans. Conversely, it does move Democrats somewhat this way. So telling people that it's not statistically significant, but it does move some people. But for the most part, I think that these arguments don't really move public opinion very much, even for respondents who are not following the issue. So this creates this paradox, right? That those most likely to change their views on aid to Ukraine are also those who are not following the issue very closely, right? So the challenge is trying to get people to follow the issue first, and then you have to try to persuade them, and that's really difficult to do. Will it be enough to sway Congress? I think the most generous thing I can say is that the public opinion environment is permissive enough that Congress can do whatever they want, and they're not going to be punished or rewarded for it either way. That the outcome is really going to be driven by elite bargaining rather than about mass opinion. Thank you very much.
Thank you. And now we have Alexander Cooley, who is who's the Clerk Professor of Political Science and Vice President of the Journal College at Columbia. He's also a distinguished scholar of how international actors shape the post-Soviet space. And my assumption is that he'll be talking about how the war reverberates in the global south and in the Central Asia, which he is a big specialist.
Yeah, thanks so much. It's a real pleasure, privilege to be here with such wonderful researchers and scholars and knowledgeable audience. I eschewed slides mainly because I couldn't imagine doing it in less than 30. That is not what you want to see. You want to get to the Q&A. So let me make just some salient points here. I think the question about Ukraine war and the global South and Central Asia it's complicated, but you don't have to rely on my expertise to know that. But I would argue it's complicated in the way that we actually have some pretty sharp trends. We have some vectors coming in right now about different trends on different issues in different parts of the world that I think are worth discussing, right? So, the remarkable geopolitical story here is just days after Russia's invasion was the rapid unification of the West, right? Looking at just across the board, right? Public opinion, support for Ukraine, looking at the imposition of sanctions, the coordination between the European Central Bank and the US Treasury, right? Having this sequenced, ready to go. We see unprecedented individual sanctions targeting the oligarchs, their stigmatization. We see the pullout of Western corporates out of Russia, right? Not just consumers like McDonald's and IKEA, but energy companies, right? ExxonMobil, BP, endured every kind of quote unquote political risk in Russia, all making these boardroom decisions within 72 hours. No, we're gone. We're stranding assets, right? So really remarkable. Of course, the attitudes towards Ukrainian refugees, the expansion of NATO. This week is important, right? Sweden cleared the last hurdle of ratification in Hungary. So all of a sudden, now we have 2 new NATO members, each in a sort of a strategic part of the world. So, this was interpreted by many, especially at the time, as the unification of the West. And Dan Nexon and I wrote a short piece in Foreign Affairs a month afterwards, saying, well, it's not quite the West. It's like the Western hegemonic cartel, right? It is the European Union, it is the US, it is Japan, and certain allies. Taiwan, South Korea joined export controls in the way that they haven't before, right? I think this part of the story, right, was so remarkable that, combined with the overwhelming votes in the UN General Assembly, right, where we see only about, a handful of countries voting for Russia, right? But we did see some abstentions, right? China, India, and you start totaling up the abstentions in terms of population, and they're almost sort of half of the global population, sort of, initially, right? What does that mean? I do think we have seen the following shift, especially in the quote unquote global South, and I'm going to hit some very random sort of places. And the shift has corresponded in some ways to Russian messaging. It's just about what this war is about, right? First month, this is about denazifying Ukraine. And then you see this in public messaging too. Sort of State Department has done sort of analyses of sort of public messaging and so forth. And you know what? The denazification thing doesn't play well in Egypt. It's just not resonating, right? It's not part of like, the messaging there, right? So even though this did hit some, I would say transnational right networks, right? And it gives some denazification and so forth. It didn't resonate. What started and has resonated and continues to resonate is Russia trying to make this a proxy war to what it describes as the dissatisfaction with the international US-led world order, right? That this has become a vehicle into which you can start pouring in your historical dissatisfactions with a Western-run world, right? Or perception status. So what are some of the themes that we see? We see an imperialist agenda, right? The US, just NATO expansion is part of this. You see accusations of hypocrisy and double standards, right? That, the US and its allies believes in sort of human rights and democracy in very limited types of areas and countries, right? And you see an increasing sort of intensity and pushback against Western exceptionalism. Yeah, like that sort of appears here, and especially this fusion sort of, Tim was showing the prompts on sort of normative judgment. This was part of a lot of messaging in the European Union and in the US in Central Asia. Like, let us begin with the moral dimension, the normative dimension. Again, perfectly understandable, but this was the shift that was made. So I would say the sort of fallout of this, you can see this in a lot of places, but I would say especially South Asia, Francophone Africa, support for Russia is increasing, and it is, according to a couple of surveys that we have, the Economist Intelligence Unit has sort of polled on this, also European Council on Foreign Relations, favorability of Russia is trending upwards, above 60% in both of those areas, right? Sort of a straight, and yeah, there's propaganda and there's messaging against anti-imperialism. But just to give you sort of, some other flavors of this, all three major Middle Eastern allies that the US had, right, did not support Ukraine, right? Talk about Saudi Arabia. That was, again, conducting sort of bilateral negotiations over oil price and sort of the effect of the oil price cap, right, very openly, sort of with Moscow. The UAE, which became a hub for sanctioned Russian individuals, right, parking their yachts, but more importantly, re-registering their businesses, right, in a very sort of opaque number. And the US was not willing, pressuring from the inside, but not willing to designate them in the manner that was appropriate for their behavior. And Israel, right? We'll return to Israel in a little bit in ways that I think you didn't see coming. Where again, the sort of initial stance was one of neutrality. There's constituents on both sides and so forth. I think one particular shock that drove this, and now we're going to go from the Middle East, we're going to go to Latin America. This time last year, President Lula of Brazil kind of shocked, I think, Western media, saying that Zelensky was as much to blame for the war as Vladimir Putin. What was sort of stunning about this, and why this issue, I think, caught the US so off guard? First of all, there was the request that was made, which is basically, could Brazil and other Latin American countries, right, send old weaponry and hardware to Ukraine, and that they would be replenished with modern US sort of systems, right? And Lula said, no, we're not going to do this. And Zelensky's to blame. And he got behind the Chinese peace plan. This was this kind of hodgepodge of like sort of complicated sort of narratives and tropes. What infuriated the Biden administration was that in the domestic politics context, they were ready to go to the mat to support Lula's election against Bolsonaro. Bolsonaro was viewed as Trumpist, right? His son has ties also with the NRA, the transnational right? There was, a preparation possibly to do kind of a January, 6th style sort of, protest in Brazil, and they had gained this all out, right? Back channeled this, and all of a sudden Lula out of nowhere does this, right? Then I think, especially in sort of Latin America, you start seeing the administration changing their frame. This is about the liberal world order. First, it's about democracy. I actually think it should have been about sovereignty all along, but I'll just keep the focus on the analysis. And that plays right into Russian messaging, right? Because again, everyone has a dissatisfaction with the liberal world order. It is hypocritical. It is selective, right? It is, saying one thing in one area and doing something else in another, right? Realpolitik does trump values like a lot of the time, if not most, right? So there's stability there. I think the other issue that I saw on the American side was they really downplayed the potential for these issues to become muddled. So to delve into a little bit on Latin American politics, yes, there is a segment of Latin American countries that are multipolar, right? They engage with China and Russia, right, in significant ways. Venezuela, Nicaragua, right, recognize the independence of Abkhazia and South Ossetia, right, Cuba, of course, these countries. But the vast majority of Latin American countries that supported Ukraine and support Ukraine certainly officially, right, their beef with the consultation of the US was much more in sort of the Republican tradition of Latin America, right, that they don't like being told what to do or say, that they rely on consensus, on deliberation, right, that this wasn't sort of openly, negotiated and deliberated, that there was just a presumption that they would do this when sort of requested, right? So again, it's complicated and it feeds into this entire political history, of course, that's nothing to do with Ukraine, about US-Latin America relations. So I want to flag, in closing, 3 issues that I think are really important, and this is where I'll get into Central Asia. One, we now have a lot more studies about sanctions and what sanctions are doing and the architecture of global sanctions evasion. And it is, highly illuminating and I think deeply concerning, right? And so when we look at Central Asia, the presumption, I would say all the way through fall 2022, on the US side, others will know the EU side more, is that somehow Central Asia would be on board, right? That they too were scared with sort of, sovereign annexation, with sort of this nationalist rhetoric coming over, from Russia and so forth. They were seeing the kind of volunteer delivery of humanitarian aid in Kazakhstan by a small segment of the population, and they didn't look at the reverse and the flip side, that there was other polling in places like Kyrgyzstan, overwhelming support, right, for Russia. Overwhelming views of Russia being a stabilizer. You might say, how can Russia be viewed as a stabilizer? Well, in every kind of exogenous shock that we've had in the last 15 years, this is overwhelming sort of public opinion, from COVID to the events of January 2022 in Kazakhstan and CSTO intervention and so forth. But what we really missed in this talk about sort of the colonial identity of Central Asia vis-a-vis Russia is an understanding of how Central Asia was deeply ensconced in post-Soviet institutions that have allowed sanctions evasion, right? By that, I mean the Eurasian Economic Union, both formally and informally, the kinds of practices that you have seen, sort of, trucks destined for Central Asia, dumping, cargo off in Russia, formal collusion between sort of customs officials, all the stuff that we're seeing now, and the massive reorientation of EU exports in critical areas from Russia directly to the Central Asian states, and also, by the way, Armenia and Georgia. Azerbaijan is not about it. So I'll just give you one stat. There's a bunch out there. Central Asian machine exports to Russia, right? 2022, Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan rather, is up 250%, Kazakhstan up 500%, Kyrgyzstan 2,500%, right? And any one of these is sort of small and the total value isn't that much, but you start to add them all up, as some people are doing now, and we get to about, just Central Asia, about 35% of what would be exports to Russia total value. Now, tack on to that, right? The increase, right, in new exports from China to Central Asia, up 44% in 2022. Now we're really nudging towards what those trade volumes were, right? We have a systematic and evolving area. How did we miss this? Well, part of the reason we missed this is, Kyrgyzstan actually has a history of being an entrepot during its independence. It was the first country to join the WTO. It's part of the world in 1998, and it's leveraged its position in the WTO and back then in the customs union to foster re-export into the post-Soviet space. So these are networks, and this is sort of a sensibility that has been there. It's just been repurposed. Also, Japarov is clearly friendly towards Putin by all accounts. There are a clear sort of interests in the re-export too. I would just say sort of data points, look at trends in migration, 2023. They're exploding in part because there's a labor shortage in Russia, but also an increased, perception that despite being potential to be drafted and so forth, that Russian citizenship may be available, right? Hundreds of thousands of Tajiks have obtained Russian citizenship just over the last 5 years, right? These are serious sorts of, incentives that are keeping these ties afloat. Look at the mobility numbers in higher ed from UNESCO. Like, all the Central Asian countries send students overwhelmingly to Russia. The only one that doesn't is Uzbekistan. That's number 2. Destination number 1 is Kyrgyzstan, because there are lots of different sort of independent schools there. So all this to say, what we've seen is a reconstitution of ties in these, ways that have been influenced by these Russian-led institutions and repurposed, perhaps in unintended ways, to facilitate this re-export and evasion. The other issue I'll point to on here is the impact of the recent conflict in the Middle East, right? And so we see now the Kremlin openly pro-Hamas, pro-Palestinian, welcoming delegations, so forth. They see the polling on this, the popularity, and they see this as a way to deepen engagement. And Moscow's Middle East sort of policy is extremely complex, right? The way they're playing both and triple sides all the time with each country. But one of the things that they're doing is that they are really taking advantage again of this messaging of US hypocrisy, right? Human rights violation, of sort of acquiescence and destruction of Gaza, and so forth. And this is, images of the US, yes, they go back and forth, absolutely, taking, of course, massive hits throughout the Middle East, but not just on this. So if looking at the sort of trends and what would you expect it's in the third year, I'd say two sort of issues out there I'll put on your horizon that aren't there, where again I think Russian messaging will focus on these ordering dimensions. Reconstruction, right? And appropriation of assets and war crimes accountability, right? And I think both of these you're going to see Russia really pull memes about the exceptionalism that Ukraine has. Like, why don't other countries get $400 billion, right, to rebuild their countries, right, after sort of the conflict? You're going to see this as, and you've seen sort of signs of this already in terms of messaging, again, of the favoritism of IFIs. And secondly, we've already seen this with the fiasco of Putin not going to South Africa because of his indictment, sort of the ICC. So Russians are really going to hammer on the hypocrisy and the selectivity of the ICC, especially as they're conducting continued outreach into sort of sub-Saharan Africa. So all this to say, most of this has nothing to do with Ukraine, and yet they have been implicated in what is a much broader set of geopolitical pressures, narratives, and frankly, unintended consequences as a result of the war. Thanks.
Thanks to all the presenters for the fantastic and very insightful talks. So I want to welcome everyone back to the table and move on to the Q&A. So we'll take the first question from the room. And when you're asking, please introduce yourselves.
It'd be helpful to know which sources the polls are coming from. I've heard Kiev Institute, who also superficial research. Are there others?
The polls I was quoting they were conducted by these.
Keith's, although I look at other agencies as well. It's just Keith's does the most and they're the most current.
Mine also, please.
I use InfoSapiens.
Thanks for the wonderful lecture. It was quite fascinating to hear a lot of these perspectives. My question is primarily for you, sir, Professor Cooley. So I'm a graduate from CEPA last year. I graduated. I work in Kuwait now at the embassy of the political officer. And one thing I do agree with what you were saying about the region itself and the messaging that's out there right now. Kuwait being they have the fourth largest sovereign fund in the world, but they've given less than $1 million to Ukraine in form of generators. And I was talking to the Ukrainian ambassador recently, and he was just complaining about that after the war in Gaza, all the doors are locked. Even us as Americans, we can't even bring that issue up. Anytime we bring up Ukraine, all we hear about is hypocrisy on Gaza. So we can't even do anything anymore since that. And Ukraine has nothing to do with it. I mean, quite honestly, like you said yourself. So I guess my question would be twofold. First, how can we approach this? Obviously these countries are large donors across the world. They do donate a lot of money. But $1 million, that's even Saudi Arabia that donate quite little, quite honestly. And I know Zelensky is doing it right now. And my second question would be in regards to Central Asia. What do you think is the way out? I mean, for a lot of these countries that are so intertwined and so interconnected with Russia, because no matter what you do now from our standards and from what we're trying to do, if they have a way out, they'll use it.
Yeah.
So that pressure is not doing what it's supposed to.
Yeah. No, thanks for that. Look, none of these recommendations are, gonna move the needle that much. I hope I'm wrong, but I do think the messaging needs to be about sovereignty as opposed to democracy, even though Ukraine, of course, is fighting for democracy. We sort of seen that as whole. I think sovereignty just resonates in the global south more. I do think also that the prospects of participating in Ukrainian reconstruction, if you can't make a normative argument, you make a material argument, right? That when these contracts are going to be distributed, right? The Ukrainians are going to have, a big say over who stood by them and who didn't, right? I think that would be a second messaging. Third, and the more kind of intriguing idea of Central Asia is putting the pieces, the networks in play right now that you think about, can Central Asian labor participate in the reconstruction of Ukraine? And to actually divert the vectors that are going into construction in Russia. And this might be possible in Tajikistan that is not re-exporting, not nearly to the same degree that we see. Like would be sort of an inducement there. So there are things that you can do maybe subtly to move the needle. But I appreciate you sharing that view from the ground.
So we have a question on Zoom. This is a question for Emma from Victoria Udaltsova. And the question is about social networks. You mentioned some examples where citizens relied on pre-existing networks to mobilize. There are probably many examples of people who did not rely on pre-existing networks joining the army or the World War effort. So to what extent do you think they matter? And is this something you're looking at in your current work?
So this is something that's kind of tricky. Social network ties are notoriously tricky to measure, right? Like they are something that are tricky to capture, especially in survey data. I do know that when I was doing my field work on the ground and I was speaking to people who'd been very involved in participating in the work in some way in places like Bakhmut, Chernihiv, and Dnipro, essentially every single person I spoke to either said that they mobilized alongside people they were already active with, or if they hadn't been involved before, they had kind of like joined in and jumped on the actions of somebody they know. Of course, this isn't completely representative data, and there might well be, there probably are folks who aren't so well connected with existing networks, but this kind of falls in line with what we know about other forms of mobilization. So when we research, for example, what motivates people to participate in protests, people are more likely to participate in protests if they join in with other people that they know, or they have friends and family going along. So I would say that social network ties are important, but of course there will be people who will have, mobilized more independently, or maybe have not been part of such strong ties. There are, many different kind of strengths of social ties. So I hope that's
So we'll have another question from the room, but I just want to say for people on Zoom, please type in your questions in the Q&A.
My name is Michael Violet. Short question. Professor Frye, you said that if the vote came in the House of Representatives, you think that the vote would pass. That in effect means that only 4 Republicans would need to support it, assuming they have all the Democrats. How many actual Republicans would vote? That's my first question. My second question relates to Emma's presentation and the one after. I think you had said that 80% of the Ukrainians are active in supporting the war effort and are doing things to help out. Then the next speaker, you said you thought the majority of the people in Ukraine were just trying to survive. Seems like there's a little disconnect between majority just trying to survive and 80% who are actually active trying to help.
So I don't know how many but the first vote or in the summer, I think it was 57 Republicans voted against the aid. But there was this kind of hard wing that is the Representative Gosar from Arizona and a group around him, Matt Gaetz and a few others, that had really kind of wagged the dog on this. And then when President Trump picked it up, Republicans are afraid. They're afraid of Donald Trump. So I do think it would pass. I would like to think that I'm an optimistic person. I would like to think that people would vote their conscience, but history suggests, particularly recent history in American politics, suggests that that's not a very betting proposition. But you do have, a small enough number. You have a small number of Republicans who have been vocal in support of this. That I'm basing their vote on their already public testimony. They've already come out in favor of it. So I don't think that they would, risk more punishment from Trump by pushing this, by voting for it.
Maybe I can answer and then Volodymyr can pick up. So that 80% figure, that encompasses a really wide variety of engagement. So that includes people that have joined the army or volunteered in territorial defense. It includes people who donated and people who are volunteering. So the percentage that's volunteering is around about 40%, give or take. And that volunteering can also mean very different things. Like that 80% is not all folks that are running donation centers or evacuating people from under shelling or hosting IDPs, right? There are a lot of smaller, more everyday actions. Some of the examples and the photos that I have in my presentation are focusing more on these, what Volodymyr and we just talked about was more extraordinary things, but there are a lot of more everyday actions, which I think can also come from this kind of constituency of folks that Volodymyr describes as trying to survive, right? So like elderly folks, like I heard a lot of stories of elderly women, like, knitting socks or hats for men. These are people, this also, this 80% figure includes people who maybe dropped off some old clothes to the donation center. So it, there is a small number of folks doing some very high commitment, high cost actions, but there are also a lot of folks alongside trying to survive that are contributing in small ways. And maybe
Yeah, I believe first there is a social disability bias. So people exaggerate a bit. I mean, they might have done something once, and they tend to report that they are doing that, continue to do that. And second, it's not necessarily mutually exclusive. Trying to survive and occasionally doing something good for others. I was arguing that the main goal of them, the main preoccupation of them is survival and enduring the war. At the same time, it doesn't mean to be exclusively focused on yourself. You are focusing on yourself and your family, but also on people around you. And occasionally, you might want to do something more for others. And especially that it's so easy for financial donations are the easiest way. So many people do that precisely because it's so easy. You might be fleeing the war, being even abroad, and from abroad, from a safe haven, you find it very easy and compelling and feeling good, when you do that. So it's not necessarily exclusive, but still, I believe that 80% it's a bit inflated figure. So, but we rely on what people say. Yeah.
Yeah, another question.
Yes, actually, two questions. One is maybe a rhetorical question, whether the oxygen might be a good metaphor for what's happening. First, you put the oxygen on yourself, and then you sleep on your face. So that's first one. Second one is a question for Professor Frye. I'm wondering if you consider the military as one of the factors that you would consider in your control groups. Military is twice as trusted as the presidency, and 10 times more trusted than the Congress. What if you make the argument that the military has a very clear view about Ukrainian conflict? Without support, the job of American military will be very difficult without support in Ukraine. Is that an interest?
I mean, with regards to the oxygen mask metaphor, I think that is certainly incredibly important. Like, right, when I read accounts of interviews with people reporting what was happening in the first days of the full-scale invasion, the first people they contact were their immediate family and friends and their loved ones, trying to secure survival. But one thing that is really interesting is, if I go back to this kind of like statistical analysis we've done of this survey data, is we looked at direct action forms of engagement. So when we look specifically at people who just participate in volunteering, we found that people who'd been displaced by the full-scale invasion were no more or less likely than people who hadn't to actually engage in things like volunteering. So I think there's a few different factors there. For some people, it's certainly put on the oxygen mask before you can help others. But I think there's also something which I've seen coming through more in qualitative work is that some of these folks whose lives have been so completely turned upside down by the full-scale invasion have a very strong motivation to help other people. So, you know, that's not to say that's representative of the whole population, but I think there's different people impacted in different ways, for sure.
We have a question on Zoom, question from Jim Dingerman. And this is a big question. Does the panel think that given the tempo of the war going now, is Ukraine without military aid vulnerable to a Southern France style 1940 collapse? That's probably a question for Volodymyr and Emma, if you're willing to take it. There's not a question about Trump, but I think we'll probably.
Yeah. Well, I don't think is going to be 1940 because the U.S. is not the only supplier of weapons to Ukraine and ammunition and financial aid. So and we see now what was it you, Tim, who showed the data on the amount of military supply? So I was surprised to see that Germany is supplying almost half of what the US is supplying. So US stands out, but not as much as in the first year of the war. So what we see is that when the US is thinking about whether how to appease Trump, Scholz is becoming more resolute all of a sudden. You know, he took his time for sure, but now he and Macron are more resolute and both rhetorically and in terms of action, and so they are not as constrained by their own parliaments as Biden is. So and small countries like look at Denmark, so they are doing actually extraordinary things. So we saw Slovakia giving up everything they had, especially that the Western coalition knew that they would lose election, and they knew that the new coalition would not be forthcoming. So they gave everything, So now smaller countries, Netherlands are more resolute, Denmark is more resolute. So we are seeing a lot of support, and Ukraine is not as weak. Ukraine is not as disorganized, So even if assuming a nightmare that nobody is helping Ukraine has its own production first, and Ukraine will gradually maybe withdraw, but not necessarily crumble, So I don't believe in the 1940 scenario.
Yeah. I would also echo that, especially if we focus on dynamics and what's happening within Ukraine. Yes, so many people are tired of the war, have been traumatized, but I'm not a military strategist, but folks said Ukraine would fall in a few days or weeks, in 2022, when, there was much more of a surprise. I think it's highly, I think one of the reasons why the resistance was so successful was because so much of the population actually stepped up to engage in such a way. And I think if there was another strong, forceful push from Russia, I don't think that Ukrainians would be likely to react differently. I think that people once again would stand up and would put their lives on the line and be willing to take risks, even if the Western support is forthcoming. I mean, just look at Ukraine's history.
All right, so we'll take one last question from the room.
Hi, my name is Chris from the exchange student here. I had a question actually related to probably like the term that was thrown around a lot, which is social desirability. So the first question here is, I guess, like pertaining anyone on the panel actually, like have there been narratives or also push on in terms of not only like positively focusing on the people that help as desirable, but also shaming the people who don't, or putting under scrutiny certain parts of the population who might be like more invasive to this? Because secondly, a sub question of that is, like there was an article on The Economist that was potentially mapping out the difficulties of the territories that might be covered, that sometimes the people that were get liberated by the Ukrainian army are sometimes also like put under scrutiny because of like potential risks of like seeing some as collaborators, or maybe like some as not being helpful enough in some instances. So I was wondering if that is a concern now, or maybe that's just like overblown, or maybe too much into future. I don't know.
Well, I think that's a great question, and we have a master's student who's writing her thesis on what it means to be a collaborator and some of the ways that Ukraine is dealing with that, because that is a complicated issue, and I think it would be more of a sharp and problematic issue when the territory gets deoccupied, or it is, right? There's court cases going forward from the very, going back to the very beginning of the war in the territory that's deoccupied. Because it's not always clear. Sometimes it is clear when a government official collaborates, sometimes it's less clear when, you know, a lower level official or a teacher does what they need to do to survive. So that would probably be an ongoing complexity for Ukraine to deal with. And I don't know if I would go so far as narrative, but another problem that might be brewing around the horizon is this idea of how do we understand the people who left the country and went into, you know, self-selected exiled emigres, because there are 6.5 million of them, although more than 1 million are in Russia. And it's a whole nother, you know, issue. Some of them are trying to get out of Russia and they're trapped. But yeah, there's a lot of people who left the country, and especially mothers with children. And some people within Ukraine resent that. So there could be a lot of internal conflict and discussion coming to the fore. But I think that, you know, the country's gonna have to figure out how to manage that and how to address that.
That would be a good problem to have, right?
Yeah, yeah, get our people back.
Yeah, I think absolutely. I mean, what I've seen in terms of discussions on this is that, you know, these are going to be big questions and big issues, but they're not the most immediate problem. So I think there's, you know, discussions and thoughts going on behind the scenes, but there's a sense of, you know, we need to win first. Did you want to?
Yeah, I believe it depends on where you look from. So from Kiev, it's not the most important issue. But if you are in Izium, newly liberated town or village, I've heard a lot of stories and how people believe that collaborators are not punished enough. And how that contributes to resentment and low trust in public authorities. Actually, some local authorities who did collaborate with the Russians during the occupation are now back in the position of authority under Ukraine, you know, and so that contributes to the erosion of trust, in not just in those people, but in the authority as such, you know. So I believe it's a conscious strategy on the Ukrainian part not to peddle this too much during the war. Some believe that if you persecute everybody who collaborated, there will be nobody left in the local self-government bodies in these territories. Some believe it will be divisive and counterproductive, but definitely the most kind of fragment cases of collaboration are being investigated. But that's somehow put on a back shelf, and the time will come when it will become a more prominent issue publicly. But I believe for localities where they observe this collaboration, where many people suffer from that, that's an important issue of trust and local cohesion.
Right. Thanks everyone again for joining us. The frank assessments, but also for a bit of hope. And join us for our future events on the train.
Thank you. Thank you. Thanks, Sam.
Yeah.
That was good, thank you. By the way,
Something needs station.
yeah.
And then I realized that all of the names, my son was